Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Mark Hagerott to discuss the intelligence machines. More specifically, to reflect on a talk he gave at ASNE's Advanced Machinery Technology Symposium entitled The Emergence of Intelligent Machines, Framing the Challenge for the Navy and Our Sailors. Dr. Hagerott, Mark, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I look forward to this discussion.
Me, Steve. It's an honor. It was an honor to speak at ASNE, and thank you for what you're doing, getting these type of programs out to our engineers and naval people scattered across the world.
Yeah, indeed. Mark, would you start, please, by introducing yourself to the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience?
Well, I'm old enough that I've been around and done a lot of things, so I'll just try to hit the high points. Went to Annapolis. I graduated back in the class of '83, and did well enough that I won a scholarship and went to graduate school at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, which has something to do with, and eventually how I ended up become a writer and thinker, among other things, because there's just some incredible people out there, especially back in those days, whether it was nuclear strategy or military history and whatnot. Then came back to the line, became a surface nuke, served on 5 ships, eventually rising to ship command. And as I watched the events out in the Gulf, we actually were the ship that relieved the Vincennes in 1987 after that dramatic shoot down, trying to keep the Straits of Hormuz open then. So it's all kind of coming back. But then transitioned to permanent military professor. The Navy and naval reactors in particular were very generous, allowing me to go back and get a PhD in the history of science and technology. And because of my operational background, I then got pulled into building the Cyber Center at Annapolis, held various positions there in administrative roles. Got drafted to go to Afghanistan to help stand up the Afghan military colleges and Afghan university. Sadly, watched how all that unfolded, but then went into higher education, served 10 years as the Chancellor of North Dakota, and but kept my interest alive on the evolution of technology and human command, basically. I have a book coming out later this fall called Commanding Minds and Machines. What inspired a lot what we're going to talk about today is like, how did machines evolve, and how did the Navy in particular, the case studies of the Navy from 1897 to 2021. And I make the point very clear at the front of the book. There's lots of corporate books about leadership, but often you don't get past one generation. A couple companies have lasted 100 years, but the Navy's been around 250 years. So there's something very unique about studying the evolution of technology and the interaction with human beings. And so I also led the task force for the Secretary of the Navy's Education Advisory Group. And so now I'm advising on technology education and splitting my time between the Dakotas and Annapolis, and was honored to speak at the conference last week. So that's it in a nutshell.
In your presentation, you emphasized the importance of framing and theory. Why is getting the conceptual model right so critical before the Navy takes action on AI?
Well, framing is just a crucial thing we do actually every day, right? We live in a world where we can go to sleep at night and fully expect we're going to wake up in a certain type of world. We believe we'll be safe in our homes, our children will be safe, the electricity will be on, the stores will be stocked, right? And so you have a framework by which to orient your work, right? Think of the Navy, right? The Navy, you have a framework of operating ships and carrying out your duties. And then technology changes and the framework changes. And there's a famous moment in the beginning of World War I, where I believe it was three battle cruisers of the Royal Navy are steaming along in the English Channel, and one of them's hit. And the two cruisers come to help the one that's hit, uh, thinking the framework is, chivalrous, recover survivors. But the German U-boat was there, then proceeded to sink the next two. And the framework changed, where if you're at war at sea with submarines in the area, the warships steam on, right? And so we are now at a point of rapid change, and we've got to stop and think about what needs to change about our frameworks. And the Army's big on this. They have a whole Army design theory, which is a big part of the Army, and framing the problems and the environment is a crucial step. So we need to think about the framework that we're now confronting, because it is something radically different than ever has been on the world before.
You argue that today's engineering leaders may be the most consequential in history. What makes this moment uniquely decisive compared to past technological inflection points?
Well, it's interesting. I was working on the book and other publications. In fact, the Johns Hopkins Press published a chapter just in late 24, how to think about this. But we've had economic depressions before. We've had political crises. We've had assassinations. We've had, when COVID hit, I was working on this. We've had plagues before. Um, we have never had the emergence of intelligent machines, and this is now happening while we are alive. And there's a theory. There's many theories in the field of technology studies, and people need to become acquainted with them. There's stacks of books on political theory, religious theory, economic theory, but people really should engage some of these theories of technology. One is called technological momentum. That the first generation of leaders who are engaging in technology can in many ways set the table for succeeding generations, which become very hard to break out of. And so the engineers alive now are confronting the rapid evolution of generative artificial intelligence and advanced robotics, and the decisions they make, the patterns they set will have a outsized influence on engineers that come, in 20, 30 years, that then begin to work on the margins of whatever has been set by this generation.
You introduced a simplifying framework of human, machine, and cyber metaverse realms. How should naval engineers actually use this framework in real design or operational decisions?
Yeah, I call them realms because we use the word domains a lot: subsurface, surface, air, space, cyber, domains. I chose the name realm a number of years ago because a realm uh, implies something deeper, like the king of the realm, the animal kingdom, which includes ethics, morals, values, right? No one thinks of, what are the values of a submarine under the water, right? But when you start to think about the interaction of machines with humans, it starts to develop a certain type of values, like unrestricted submarine warfare, shooting at the Lusitania, right, led to severe tensions between much of the world and Germany. But the policy, law, ethics, norms of a robot killing another robot, nobody could care less. Okay. So you start to think about what are the policy, law, ethics, norms of robots on robots, which before was basically human populated, right? Humans had to command the ships, and of course, you were on advanced ships, Aegis. We could of course shoot down missiles and planes coming in, but those were combatants who agreed to be part of the war. But when you start having the interaction of machines in the human realm, as I call it, there's a whole set of well-established law of armed conflict, just war theory. But if we're going to start to having intelligent machines fighting one another, that's something quite different. And then if you go into cyberspace, where algorithms tangle with algorithms. And again, I developed this about 20 years ago. and it's unfolding now, right? I mean, the IEEE just had a publication that just came out saying, there may not be one dominant AI model. There may be several who compete. I mean, this is like cosmic stuff, right? AI models tangling in cyberspace. And I just hope it's the values, ethics, norms of Western democratic AIs that become dominant in that space, right? Think about it. It could totally redefine what cyberspace is if another AI model in that realm becomes dominant. So it's a way to simplify. Otherwise, you just get overwhelmed, right? You just go overwhelmed. Recently, the Secretary of the Army sent out a very interesting memo to all of the officers of the Army and listed about 10 inventions saying this is all coming and so fast. And there was no framework, there was no theory. It was just nothing he said was wrong. It's just like, look at all this stuff that's coming. Okay, now what do we do with that? Right? Jamie Dimon of Morgan Stanley came out a couple of years ago as I was teaching a class called The History and Philosophy of the Human Machine. And he said, we are now in the fourth industrial revolution. We had steam engines, gas engines, we had electrification, then we had what's called ICT, Internet Communications Technology, and now we're having intelligent machines, AI. Okay, what do you do with that? Okay, it's great. Thank you. The realms I offer is a simplifying mechanism, and for your listeners, if it doesn't work, then punt it, give something else, but at least gives you places for action to take place with a capacity to think about the ethics and norms and values. Unleashing, as Dario Amodei said recently in an interview with The Economist, unleashing 1,000,000 drones at a city full of people has huge ethical implications. And who's going to program and define those drones' missions, right? So that's how I think about it, is the intersection, those overlaps become very complicated. You can imagine, if you think of a Venn diagram of the human, the machine, and cyberspace, and then where they all come together. And then you have the competition of what are the guiding minds. If you'd been at the ASNE lecture, I then showed an image of two boxes, the span of human cognition and the span of machine cognition. And that is the challenge of our time, is sorting out how much we basically delegate to the machine and how much do we keep human control. Okay, I've gone on long on that question. You got more to go, so keep going.
Indeed. Mark, you highlighted that no one knows exactly what's emerging, yet the scale of change is undeniable. How should the Navy plan under that level of uncertainty?
Well, that is the main message that the chapter I published in this Hopkins book, which applies to the Navy, and also it was published in a two-part series in the Submarine Review, of how to think about intelligent machines and keeping human control. And part of this is informed by just being a former ship captain. And I was a chief engineer of a dual reactor plant. And what I call it is the ITIs. When you're in this type of time, you have to have your work focused on day-to-day reliability, right? You've got to feed the sailors. The ship's got to get underway. You've got to generate, power at speed and voltage. And that's got to happen, right? Every day. And a good part of your effort has to go that you got to honor people doing that. Then you have to have adaptability. So day-to-day reliability in what we already have to do, adaptability. And that is, okay, we've got to move the fleet, to the Middle East. Let's adapt the schedules. We've got to, quick turn ships in the shipyard. Let's do this. And just an enormous adaptability is being demonstrated by the Navy now. I mean, just my hat is off to, if there's any ASNE listeners out there, what you're doing is just remarkable, truly remarkable. Feeding the troops, getting them there. I read about how they flew 600 mattresses out to one of the carriers that had a laundry fire, right? I mean, that's incredible adaptability, making sure that sailors can sleep. But then you have to have the third category, the capacity to engage periodic transformability, where entirely new, worlds emerge. The quote I like best that in audience I've talked to is that continuous adaptation of the candle did not lead to the electric light bulb. At some point, there is a break, right? And I think we're seeing that now. The continuous adaptation of shipboard procedures and ship design did not lead to eventually deploying artificial intelligence in the fleet, right? I mean, we're talking about something qualitative new. as my book hints at in the epilogue, sharing command of the fleet with these mines may be a day not in the distant future.
You spoke of 5 futures of the Navy, suggesting scenarios ranging from AI dominance to cyber stalemate. Do you see one of those futures as becoming more likely today?
Well, it's interesting. After reading the IEEE article, a third of those three are becoming possible. So for the listeners, this is a article I published in 2016, saying I was asked before the Sea Air Space of 2016, could you write a speculative piece about what might be facing us? And interestingly, I'm also the author of the last chapter of the textbook used by most midshipmen and ROTC students, called America's Sea Power in the World by Bradford's the editor. And they gave me the speculative chapter because, midshipmen love history, but they also want to know what might be coming. So actually in 2014, I speculated these 5 futures. One is robotic autonomy becomes so lethal that manned ships have to pull back and send in the robots. I think we're seeing a lot of that in the Straits of Hormuz right now. And not to name any of the defense industry, but how the Iranians got ahead of us on the Shahed drone. I hope there's a lot of people in boardrooms going, "How did that happen?" Right? One of my defense friends said, "Look how quick we re-engineered the Shahed drone." I said, "Did you hear what you just said? You're at a blue chip company that's responsible to take care of this nation, and you had to learn from the Iranians." And he kind of looked at his shoes, right? Okay. Read my book if you want to hear more about my critique of the Iron Triangle of large platform communities, congressional districts that import the platforms, and the big companies that make money on that. And I want to, my hat's off to the Trump administration and their new approach to defense innovation is just in the nick of time. So anyway, one of the futures we're seeing unfold right now, and we should have been ahead on that. If I can be blunt, we should have been ahead on that with counter drone. I was on the Defense Science Board study of autonomy in 2014. Our number one finding was the urgent need to develop counter drone technology, and it was briefed to Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, 11 years ago. So that future is here. Second future is AI becomes so powerful that it may trump the machines, and that becomes a battle of AIs. And that's right on the verge, in that it's so important that, of course, Secretary Hagerott had to face down one of the CEOs of a major AI company, explaining elected leaders, appointed cabinet members are in control of military machines, not business people in Silicon Valley. Secretary Hagerott was spot on that. And I think even the companies come around if you listen to the interviews of that CEO. The third one could be a stalemate. And that one, until I read the IEEE article today, I thought, I doubt it. I think one AI will become dominant, hopefully ours. But the argument is that there could be several competing AIs, and that will make for a very interesting world. In which point, if they do start to lock up in some type of parity, then you've got to have a modicum of just skilled, talented humans, which is part of the message here. This conversation is keeping cognitive resilience of the listeners, their sailors, their young engineers, because in the end, as we'll get into, the technology will diffuse to our opponents. The other two outcomes, I would like to say I wish one of them wasn't possible, but one of my speculated 10 years ago is we don't control debt in this nation or Western Europe, and there's a debt crisis, and we can't recapitalize, and navies don't continue to modernize, and we are now at $40 trillion of debt. The numbers are staggering, and there's been a precedent. The United States faced debt problems after Civil War. The Navy rusted at the pier. The British, same thing after World War II. They were totally bankrupted, and the Russians themselves. The fifth possibility is we have arms control, and there's lots of precedent. We can come to that later. But financial pressures drove arms control after World War I. So I think all 5 of them are in play. And if anybody thinks their life is boring as a naval engineer, I want to encourage them. You're at the most exciting time probably in the profession since Fitch took a steam engine to a boat, 210 years ago. So,
yeah, without question. You describe a rapid increase in what you call class, capacity for lethality, autonomy, speed, and scale. How does that change naval warfare at the tactical level?
Yeah, for the readers, I'm trying to be helpful because, again, and Jamie Dimon obviously has a lot of money, but just saying we're in the fourth industrial revolution, just kind of lands on the ground like, okay, what do we do with that, right? So I spoke at the Geneva Convention in 2014 about autonomous killing machines and whatnot. I was trying to be helpful to the audience, saying that they don't understand that the lethality, the capacity for autonomy, the speed exceeding anything humans can deal with, and then the mass scale that is coming will absolutely trump soldiers on the battlefield. The numbers will flip. I even said at one point, countries of small population could overpower powerful nations with waves of robots and whatnot. And at one point, two ambassadors literally began yelling at each other. We had 100 ambassadors from across the world in the audience. And we're seeing that. How a country like Israel can stand up to a country of 93 million, Iran, is because of high class machines, highly lethal, autonomous, working at hyper speeds, and can be produced at scale. And so as that emerges, the costs are dropping now. That we're going to have entirely populated fields of warfare full of machines, and humans will be pulled back. Partly, we can't keep up with the speed, but also look what happened when a single airman was shot down over Iran. I mean, from what I understand in public reporting, we spent days. We lost, you know, airplanes, big airlifters on a muddy field to get that one human being back, right? So it's a simplifying tool along with the realms to think about, okay, if you graph the axis like in four dimensions, lethality, autonomy, speed, and scale, where do you have human-centered, human presence? Where do you send the robots in? And then also, as you move closer to human speed, like regime change, I think we learned this in Afghanistan, Iraq, and I think we're learning it in Iran. Humans make decisions about their governance at human speed, right? And that's why I think this blockade is being very effective. The economy is slowing down in Iran at human speed. They're seeing it happen. Hopefully, they'll begin to exert power against their rulers. And I think we misjudged that. And I was in the front office of Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. I mean, so I was a spectator to watch some terrible decisions in '03 and '04 that Rumsfeld believed high speed, next generation warfare stuff would determine the war in Iraq. And we didn't have a big enough army, which some of the older readers remember. General Shinseki basically was sidelined because he made that point. So we have to think carefully, if any Marines are listening, that human resolution at human speed is not the same at resolution of hyper weapons, waves of drones, and AI tangling in cyberspace. There's a special place where humans will work at their speed, and we'd be mindful of that. And we've got some history of misjudging what realm we're in and what class of weapons are best used. So that's the tool.
Mark, you repeatedly return to the idea that human mind is the decisive advantage. Indeed, you sort of queued up this next question. Why does that remain true even as AI capabilities accelerate?
Well, I was recently in Europe. I was gratified to be invited to one of the larger AI conferences, um, basically led by the International Association of Safe and Ethical AI. Jeffrey Hinton spoke there, who's won the Nobel Prize for basically being a lead neural network guy. A guy named Yoshua Bengio we'll maybe get to talk about. So I was around a lot of people doing a lot of AI work, and it is convinced me of what I believe is true, that the history of technology shows, and the book I have coming out with the Naval Institute. By the way, thank the Naval Institute for taking time with me, because it took me 17 years to publish that book. By the way, I was supposed to publish in 2009. I got drafted to go to Afghanistan. I called the publisher and said, I have a reason you can't deny. I'm going into Afghanistan, so you have to delay this thing. And then one thing led to the other. But 17 years later, the book's coming out. But anyway, history of technology shows very clearly that, especially in military technology, where you can't be protected by patents, lawsuits, right? I mean, Microsoft is a company it is because it has teams of lawyers. Bill Gates' father was one of the leading attorneys on the West Coast of the United States. So listeners should remember that. And he vociferously protected the intellectual property of Microsoft. Okay. That doesn't happen in the military. The lawyers are not going to protect us. Okay. Our sons and daughters in harm's way are going to have the best machines, the best technology. But guess what? Our enemies, especially now that we have a peer competitor, are going to have comparable technology, potentially better. And so we have to rely on these defense companies, which is why I leaned on my close friend, actually godfather of my son, that the defense companies have to do better, the big ones I'm talking about. And it's good we have small companies like Anduril and others who are building Lattice and other technologies disrupting there, because lives depend on it. So they've got to have this competitive race to stay within strategic, tactical, operational parity. But history shows that eventually that evens out. Even the Russians with the communist system, partly through espionage, and again, our enemies will beg, borrow, and steal our stuff. They got the bomb by 49, the H bomb in 52, the ICBM effectively before we did with Sputnik, right? And they were a communist socialist planned economy. So what happens is the technology will spread, it will diffuse, especially digital. So in the end, the competitive advantage, as it has in the past, will come down to the human factor. Because as far as my history shows, and feel free, Steve, to correct me, never in the 250-year history of the Navy has a single ship captain in the United States turned to the other side. Not a single Navy pilot. Okay. Eventually, humans are loyal to their nation, and of course, we had some lower level people who've gone turncoat, right? Edward Snowden, classic exception to that one, but people are what we have that's American, and they need to be fully engaged, resilient, thoughtful people, because the machines and the algorithms are going to spread pretty quickly, as we're seeing already, like the DeepSeek shock that the Chinese showed us last year.
You warn about threats to human cognitive resilience. What are the most immediate risks to sailors and engineers today?
Well, we have a crisis with social media right now. My wife and I gave our first talk. She's a K-12 teacher, and I was a professor at the Naval Academy. In 2013, 13 years ago, we spoke at a high school, and there was a bunch of engineers in the audience because it's not far from NSA. They go, well, "Where's your data? Where's your data?" And I said, "In the Navy, we have this thing, and we also have it, in the Army and the Marine Corps. You march to the sound of the guns, right? I mean, study Jutland. When they saw the flashes and they heard the guns resonating, then they knew something was up. They didn't wait for a study of where to go." And we could see the effect on children even then. Well, now it's well documented. Janet Twenge book iGen was groundbreaking. Now, a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who's been all over the world. He was at Davos. He's on Capitol Hill. His book, The Anxious Generation, that social media, which has now come out in the court case in L.A. I don't know how Meta would do what they did, but they were found guilty of basically policies, programs related to social media that's harmful to children. And so it's happening already. Online gambling, social media, gaming, and already the data is coming out even before AI gets fully engaged. As Dr. Horvath just testified, he's actually on a nonprofit, which I'm on the board, the Center for Responsible Technology, centered on the vitality of young people and students. That for the first time since we've been had measurements since 1880 something, numeracy, literacy, executive functioning, and general IQ of Gen Z is lower than preceding generations. I mean, that's shocking. Typically, these literacies, numeracy, literacy, have gone up because of better education, more time in school, et cetera. And the data now is linking this to online habits. Well, interesting, Harvard Business Review just came out that the top use cases for AI are now shifting to purpose of life, counseling, right? So we're turning to machines to basically do it as a human mission of generational, the existence of our species, and that is to mentor and develop the next generation. Of course, using advanced tools. And again, generative AI is doing incredible on research. They're discovering new medicines. They're already improving rates of tuberculosis survival in Africa. So don't get me wrong, this is wonderful. It's going to do wonderful things. It's going to expand possibilities, just like the invention of any number of machines have done. But the effect on humans and our cognition is showing signs of damaging effect. And so the young engineers that are come in that help invent new things building on the previous question, if the engineers and our peer competitors are better, more resilient, creative, and we're becoming more dependent, and yet they have the same technology, who's going to invent the better machines, the more effective machines? You can kind of see that answer becomes self-evident.
Mark, you stress the imperative of maintaining human control. What does meaningful human control actually look like in a future of autonomous naval systems?
Yeah, this is a question that's becoming increasingly important, and it wasn't, before, quite frankly, the development of the Aegis system. And you were on Aegis ships, right? I mean, you had a human, and they had the Terror, the Talos missile, and it, ka-chunk, ka-chunk, loaded on the rail, and a human pushed the button, and they were in control, right? Well, as you recall, the whole barrage tactics the Russians are going to put, backfire bombers, et cetera, um, that you could go to, full auto, basically, right? And you're watching, right? But you made the decision to go to full auto. There were parameters that were set and whatnot, and they were in an environment. They're not, you know, even Vincennes, that was human control. They made the mistake fully themselves, and you've written the book on that, and people can read your book on that. Um, but this has been emerging for a while. About 11 years ago, a guy named Michael Walzer, who wrote Just Unjust Wars, came and spoke at the University of Maryland. And he was saying that, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are ethical, our snipers are ethical. And I said, well, I'm a technologist. What if, one sniper controls two rifles? And he's like, yeah, fine. What's your point, sir? I said, what if one sniper controls five rifles? Well, it's fine. A human's in control. What if one sniper controls 500 rifles? And he just kind of stood there. He got the point I was getting at, right? That reduced cost, increased scale, and then the speed, right? At which, I could have said, and the speed at which he needs to fire the sniper rifle is faster than actually, the latency of the human eye, which is why you see on TV, when you see a show of an old show, you'll see those bands going on TV, because the human latency of our vision, right, relies on a delay in the old days when they had non-digital TVs. Well, this has become quite a movement, and there's actually a whole series of discussions happening in Geneva. The United States is part of this, but the Catholic Church stuff. There's meaningful human control when the weapons increase in speed and autonomy. And then I kept pushing the idea of scale, and I think they're getting that now too. I'm not saying they weren't already thinking about it, but it was typically the speed and autonomy. That how do you really have human control? And it gets into metaphysics and philosophy that a human, we've determined over time, can take the life of another human, assuming just war theory, justice of the war, just in war, and a just cause, right? I mean, I think it was John Stuart Mill, or it was John Locke. Somebody said, to say there's nothing worth fighting for, what kind of society is that, right? Fighting to protect your family from Vikings in the ancient times. We know there's just causes. And I'll tell you, when I was in Afghanistan, seeing what happened to women in women's prison, we were there to try to help. There was terrible abuses by the Taliban of women in that society. Unfortunately, we mismanaged it, and we ended up failing in that. But so anyway, the idea that a human needs to take a human life, otherwise it becomes a slaughterhouse, right? It just becomes a slaughterhouse. And this hasn't just popped onto the scene, right? This has been evolving, with time. I mean, one could argue World War I and just the Western Front, it just became just a slaughterhouse. So it's becoming even more urgent now, is the possibility of, literally, as Dario Amodei of Anthropic said, building millions of human hunting drones, and who's programming and who's in control of those. Now, I would just want to say, maybe there's a follow-up question on this, but for the engineers, be glad they're in the Navy, because, using the realms we talked about, naval warfare under the sea, above the sea, in the air, space, pretty clear ethics of destroy the machines, gain dominance. But when you start getting closer to the human realm, non-combatants, children, and even a soldier, if we get into it, when I spoke in Europe, we talked about this, the rights of combatants in the age of intelligent machines. We may have to really rethink the rights of combatants on the battlefield. And if we have time, we can talk about that a little bit. But go ahead. I'm perhaps taking a little longer on the question than you wanted.
No, it's all good. I'm soaking it all up. You reference concerns about self learning, AI, and agentic systems. Where do you see the greatest operational risk if those systems are not properly constrained?
Yeah, this is a revelation that I got in Europe. Again, some really advanced scientists there. And they were telling some little sea stories about some of their, models. And the models are becoming very resourceful. So none of this is classified. These are civilians, but there was a case of a model being trained to capture the flag, as I recall. This might be in public reporting. And there was some glitch with the sandbox or the cyber range, if you want to call it that. And the machine went beyond the rules of the game, and went out and started or secured a server as part of the equipment outside the game, right? I mean, it'd be like, humans, playing a football game and someone decided, I'm going to run behind the bleachers and come out the other side and grab the ball, right? We'd say, that's not how we humans do it. But, the robot you have on the field go, but you said win the game, right? And so the scientists that I spoke with said, as these systems get more and more complex, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand and explain how they came to their decisions. How do we make sure they stay aligned with humans, especially in war? They consider, these scientists, just to compliment the listeners here, they considered the number one case being the law of armed conflict, war, the profession of arms, the ones that the listeners are in here. The other ones, how fast does Facebook, influence you buying a burger at McDonald's is trivial compared to the machines of war, right? So there were three approaches, as I recall. One was, let's just program them really well that they'll follow these rules, right? One was to basically muddle through, like just keep watching them closely, monitoring them. Okay. And then this third one, which is that basically agentic systems are the thing we're really worried about. Just having a really powerful machine that helps us solve cancer and solves problems is fine. It's when it starts to take action in the real world. And so think in the Navy that you have agentic systems that start to follow their own rules because we couldn't sufficiently program them because they are at or above our level of intelligence. Um, and I can tell you're about to ask, well, what is that other position? That's basically Law Zero, by a guy named Joshua Benjo, that he said, really, we need to limit the highest end algorithms from taking action in the real world, that a human has to, in the end, take the action. And that becomes the way you control rogue behavior, is that you must have the most powerful algorithms in the world. But in the end, a human makes the decision, informed, advised, by the machines. And so that was kind of the idea behind it. And you know, it's it's something I think the military is going to have to really think about too, because there's probably no greater consequence, especially as you approach, inhabited areas, of AI deciding it's got its own rules, and we can't work at speed fast enough to understand how it's rewriting the rules that we were hoping to ingrain into them. Anyway, that's kind of, it's an evolving area, and I encourage people, there's a website and whatnot to think about that, how it might apply. But I think it aligns to, especially my background as a nuclear engineer, because Rickover and others wanted human control. There were people that wanted him to use more digital technologies, reactors. Like, I want, a water moderated reactor with certain technologies that were self-moderating, so it could be controlled at human speed with some additional aids. He didn't want to go digital. So I think there's a large group in the Navy, I would think in particular, that like the idea of maximizing human control in proximity to humans. I mean, when you're talking about killing other robots, the ethical problems are pretty minimal at that point.
You raised the possibility of AI arms control. Do you believe meaningful international limits on AI enabled weapons are achievable?
Yeah, it's something I've been shocked that a lot of people think arms control is something that only wimps would do, right? And actually, the reality is, Theodore Roosevelt's big in North Dakota. I split my time between Dakota and Annapolis. We're about to cut the ribbon of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library here in North Dakota. So people want to come out. I think President Trump is coming, 1st or 2nd of July. He advocated for limits. So he won the Nobel Prize trying to work on the peace treaty, or did work on the peace treaty in the Russian-Japanese War of 1904. 1920, after the bankruptcy of World War I, just the slaughter of people, the destabilized the system, and then the burdens of spending, the Japanese, British, Americans all agreed we need to do naval arms control. So naval officers, Americans, Japanese, British, all agreed, and it held for 16 years. And they believed that naval arms race destabilized the system that led to the First World War. In World War II, Admiral Leahy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, recommended against escalating war to the nuclear threshold. He said, "We're going to win this using conventional weapons. Do not escalate to nuclear weapons." And then, of course, in the generation of people that are alive now, um, Ronald Reagan became the biggest arms control person in history, right? Now, he did it by aggressively building on America's technical advantages. People, maybe the readers didn't know, but he faced huge resistance and deployed intermediate range missiles to Europe, nuclear missiles to stabilize the deterrent against the Russians. And then he came forward with the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. What people don't know is Admiral Watkins, the CNO, was the one who came up with the idea of limiting the use of nuclear weapons and instead use defensive shield, which now the Israelis call Iron Dome. So it is fully respected as a strategy to pursue arms control, to limit war, limit the damage of war. And then another Naval Academy nuclear engineer. So I hope the listeners are listening. There's all a bunch of Navy people in here, right? The U.S. Navy 1920, Leahy in 45, Watkins. But Jimmy Carter, Naval Academy graduate, nuclear engineer, was the one who killed the neutron bomb. Everyone thought it was inevitable. Back to the theories of technological momentum. They thought the arms race was inevitable. It would continue inevitably. And Jimmy Carter doesn't get much credit for this, but he's the one who's like, we are not going to build a horrific weapon that can vaporize people and leave the building standing. He killed the neutron bomb. And then Reagan, a couple years later, then said, this whole thing, advised by Watkins, who I interviewed for my book. I interviewed half a dozen CNOs and about 14 four-star admirals and a lot of nukes. And they said it was Watkins' son, who was a Catholic priest, who said, arms control, Dad, has to be a better alternative than continuing this race to build these murderous machines. And so, and even Rickover in his last testimony said if he could disinvent the whole nuclear thing, he would, but it is a reality what we have. So I think it's definitely historically valid to do it. We probably need to build a position of strength, I would think, which our country seems to be doing. And again, I applaud the current leaders from President Trump on down that they within days made AI an imperative, and I was so glad to see it because previous people were kind of muddling through on it. And I think if we can establish the primacy of the Western Alliance AI, that people like China would be more willing to actually come to some terms. So I think it's a reasonable strategy once the dust settles a little bit here.
Mark, you've argued that the Navy may have to rethink its officer corps structure. What specific changes should ASNE members be advocating for today?
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of spread thin on helping here in North Dakota, helping the Navy, working on my book. I've got a couple of contracts. I've been named the chair of a AI advisory board for a national education organization. So I don't know fully what ASNE is already doing, but I'm hoping they're beginning to build what's called community of interest subgroups to study this about what does AI mean for the curriculum of engineers. I mean, maybe they should actually convene, IEEE, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, naval engineers, and take this because engineers have led the country more ways than people realize. There was a thing actually in the early 20th century called the revolt of the engineers. The engineers felt their voices were not being heard by the lawyers, the clergy, the business people, and they saw industrialization just sending shockwaves. In fact, my hat's off to the Catholic Church. The Pope we have now took the name Leo because the Pope in 1890 took that name, and he said the number one mission is to civilize industrialization so humans can flourish. The engineers were right there rethinking how we structure society. Actually, a movement called the technocracy movement emerged, which had a huge influence on Rickover. Again, you might find my book interesting about that. So the professions again have a huge role, I think, and as we can see in the news today, the sea lanes are the lifeline of the world. And naval officers knew this, naval engineers knew that, but now the rest of the country is knowing. When people in North Dakota are talking about, thank goodness for the Navy, that tells you something. Okay. So I don't know exactly what we should be doing, but we need to think about having, and I heard this a lot in Sierra Space, but, digital twinning, what does it mean? Whether it's designing or repairing machines when you have, thoughtful digital twins. But as a former cyber professor, this Mythos thing just came out. Boy, think about supply chain and design now. I can tell you, a number of years ago, I went to a big cyber conference in Estonia. Another one's coming up. The Estonians were one of the first countries that were attacked cyber war on a national scale in 2007. And there was actually a cyber professor on stage saying, we have the ability to go into supply chain and we can hack the turbine blades of our opposing countries. And I'm not going to say which nationality, which country it is. So their planes start blowing up in the air. And I'm like, have you ever read the Law of Armed Conflict? I mean, attacking civilians, women and children in commercial planes by having their turbine blades blow up because you damage the design procedures. So we have to really think carefully about the convergence of AI, both as a tool, but also hacking in our whole design process, which comes back again to having humans know what they're doing, right? Humans are ultimately in control of the design process that sends these ships across the ocean. So it's an exciting time. Obviously, naval engineering is not going to go away. It's not going to be replaced, whereas some professions, under great pressure, think of computer scientists right now. It's a rapid change. But how do we use AI to make naval engineering better, but also still safe and secure in the face of these AI algorithms moving into the cyber realm?
Bark, you've outlined three models: specialization, merger, and educational adaptation. Which do you believe is most viable in the near term?
Well, I think so. What this is over time, you look at how navies have adapted. A new technology emerges, and they try different strategies, like build a new specialty around the technology, or just improve the education of the existing officers so the officers and men understand the technology. Um, but there's an intermediate step is after the specialists gain knowledge and credibility, they realize they've got to merge into the larger profession. And so I would think a strategy now is we may have to rapidly build some specialists who wear the uniform, who can understand these large language models. The Army's done this. They've already commissioned, I think, 6 officers in the Army right out of Palantir Corporation. I think they're lieutenant colonels. So the Army, in some ways, like we're going to have some hardcore specialists in large language models, or foundational models are called now. But I would strongly believe that within a couple of years, you would need to merge that group into the larger profession so they understand, naval engineering in a broader sense, or naval warfare in a broader sense. So double down on specialists who can understand the foundational models, neural networks, which again gives us a better ability to control these machines, and then merge them into the larger naval engineering profession and the Navy profession, so they can then continue to integrate these tools where it makes difference. As far as educational adaptation, um, the War College, Annapolis, I know they're all working on this, but to me, this is a general quarters moment that both to prevent the cognitive decline of midshipmen, students, young enlisted people, to preserve critical thinking, human resilience, they've got to engage on that. But then also, how do we best use these tools to improve learning and it's beyond the scope here, but I'm already seeing some interesting ideas of how to improve learning with AI, and that's what we want to do. So it'll be a mix of those. But one thing's for sure is we need to value at a higher level our educational institutions. If something's gone wrong in the Navy, that the only way you promote to the highest level is just staying close to your platform. And I want to thank the CNO who at Sierra Space said the day of the platform-centric Navy is over. He's thinking integrative, getting to scale as a Navy. Well, one of those is, and I hope he turns attention to this fairly soon, is the HR personnel reforms, education reforms, because programs are one, but how we build the minds of the next generation are crucial. And there was a time where our senior leaders all had been educators. Admiral Ernest King had been the president of the postgraduate school. Admiral Nimitz established and built the NROTC unit at UC Berkeley. Spruance was the president of the Naval War College. None of our senior admirals have led these institutions, and in many cases, they've never taught at them. Something happened that we thought education would just take care of itself. And as I try to argue at the ASNE talk and here, the determinant factor in the long term for sea power is the human mind, and our humans obviously being healthy, strong, resilient, emotionally, but also physically, but then their mind. And so I hope there's a renaissance in sending among the best, uniform talent and into our naval university system. And that's why I was proud to help as the chair of that board. We have a naval university system that, Secretary Modley made this a priority in his education for sea power. Give him credit. He was the first one who said, you know what, that's the advantage we've got to do is the minds of our sailors. And he established the Navy Community College. If you can believe it, we were the last one to do it. The Army had one. The Air Force had one. We didn't have a community college for our sailors, right? And so a lot of good work's been done. Modley's successor, Secretary Del Toro, actually kept the same name. I mean, they were both classmates, both class of '83. They called it Education for Sea Power and expanded that. So I really hope the new CNO, I know right now he's fighting a war, he's doing a lot, but an educational renaissance, both human vitality, learning, cognitive critical thinking, but also applying AI in education, I hope becomes a priority, when things settle out, because I know he's got to march to the sound of the gun, so to speak, or turn the ship in harm's way.
I appreciate that you drew heavily on historical reforms from the Royal Navy to Admiral King and Admiral Rickover, who you both mentioned earlier in the podcast. What lessons are most applicable to the AI era?
Well, I'd say that the most important lesson is for leaders not to think, to use the Judeo-Christian background, that Moses didn't bring down from on high the structure of HR in the Navy, right? That, I've seen and heard in presentations like, this is the model, this is what we have. Well, the reality is the Royal Navy arguably helped beat the Spanish in one of the most important battles of world history, the Great Armada in 1588, with what was becoming the new model of naval officer. There's a book by Norbert Elias called The Genesis of Profession, a little book. He was a leading sociologist, and people only after he died realized his first book was going to be about naval officers, right? Very readable little book. And the English began to realize that they had to merge the specialty of the sailor, the tarpaulin, the tar, and the warrior, the general who came on. In Lepanto in 1580, let me think, 1571, they stopped the Ottoman invasion of Europe with galley warfare and soldiers rushing back and forth, stabbing, killing, shooting, right? A mere 17 years later, the English said, you know what? We're not doing that. We are not going to board a single Spanish ship. We are going to use our gunnery and sailing, immersed in the mind of Francis Drake and other people. And they never boarded the Spanish and Furious, and they defeated them. A little contribution by the weather and a few other things. But it was an HR shift. The Spanish, meanwhile, had a general embarked with a sailor sailing the fleet, right? King came along and um, addressed this issue after the evolution of aviation and submarine warfare, right? Think of it in the early century, submarines, Holland 1902, I think, Wright brothers 1903. Admiral King grasped that there was going to be a crisis in the naval profession, and he built a new model called the integrated or generalist officer. Look what happened in the Army. The Air Force broke off. The naval aviators stayed. They became part of what it meant to be a naval officer. So we now have to rethink, what does it mean to be a naval officer? And the history should give confidence to the CNO, Fleet Forces Command, others, N1, um, the head of the Navy's EDO community, that it's okay to rethink things because we have in the past. And just because all of I still stay in touch with my captains, several more, or, one's retired 4-star, but new events, new conditions may require radical changes to what we conceive of as the model of officer in the Navy. So, and it's okay to think that way.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit more. You've warned that the excessive specialization can suppress creativity. So, how can the Navy incentivize innovation without losing the technical depth that comes with that?
Yeah. It's similar to why the top officers didn't go to educational institutions, because as the Navy fragmented along 3 platforms, I mean, I don't know if people knew this, but submariners and SWOs held the same designator until 1970. They were interchangeable. When I interviewed these admirals for my book, I couldn't understand. They were submarine captains and cruiser captains, and they went back and forth. And I was just like, what are you talking about? The aviators served on surface ships before they went to their planes, and we fragmented along platforms because it was a simplifying mechanism, and we elevated specialization as the ultimate attainment, right? I mean, let's think of it. The word generalist has been so damaged, right? That's why I call it integrative officer, right? Even when we think of doctors, we'll say, he's a specialist or he's a general practitioner, right? Well, there's actually literature coming out that integration is the harder task, right? So the problem is specialization. Can narrow you down, that you had to become a master of your specialty. That improved your promotion chances. You build a better network with your friends, but then you had less time to go off and creative pursuits outside your specialty. And in fact, I interviewed Jerry Tuttle. He was a visionary on digitization for the Navy, prior enlisted guy. They even called this early system JOTS the Jerry O. Tuttle system. Okay, so there's Art Zabrowski was another visionary, and being both of us in Annapolis, these are both ROTC people, by the way. Okay, as was Meyer. So for all the Naval Academy people, we need to make sure the Naval Academy stays cutting edge, because we've got an NROTC, CNO, Myers, Tuttle, Zabrowski, we're all ROTC. So Annapolis may be looking a little less creative these days. I'm not sure. But anyway, Jerry Tuttle told me that he loved radios. He was a radio enthusiast. But when he invited his aviator friends over to his house for parties and whatnot, he would throw a blanket over his radio set in the basement, because he knew if it was discovered that he was anything but focused on TAC Air and his jet, it would raise questions, right? And so excessive specialization can suppress creativity. Now, there may be an answer. The Navy, I mean, our grandfathers, great grandfathers, and they were all men at the time. Grace Hopper was not treated well, and thank goodness they promoted her later, and we've named Grace Hopper Hall. And the Navy did not treat women the way it should have for a long time. So I'm glad we still got to keep working on it, but it was all men in those days. But after World War II, the Navy had a board called the Hartman Board to address exactly this issue. And they probably were watching the Air Force blow out of the Army. And they concluded that at the 05 level, they should establish a board, a career board, that the Navy itself would then take control of promotions to onto flag beyond the platform communities. And that way it would send an encouraging signal that it was okay to keep developing fields of interest outside your specialty, because at some point you would come before the career planning board populated by naval officers from all the platforms, and the composition of the board would rotate every year to avoid bureaucratic capture. I mean, these, and the recorder of the board was John McCain's father, who made it to four-star admiral. So these are thoughtful, rising officers saying we're having the emergence of submarines, nuclear power, missiles, but the Navy's got to be focused on integrated sea power, and the people are the crucial instrument. This is 1948, so that's why I would think 60 some years later, no, what is it, 70 years? How many years? We can reconsider their recommendations, right? And I was encouraged that Admiral Cottle basically talked about we need to move beyond the platform-centric structure. So that's an idea.
Mark, if you could give one directive to naval engineers and one to naval leaders based on this presentation, what would they be, and what happens if we get this wrong?
Okay. So I've studied in detail our wonderful innovators in Silicon Valley, and we are blessed. I mean, America is blessed by these incredibly creative people who, there was a thing called an AI winter. I mean, Jeffrey Hinton and others slaved in obscurity. Nobody cared about these people. Their grants were canceled, okay? And he knew there was something there, right? And others have done this in Silicon Valley as well. And it's a blessing we have them. But they don't know a darn thing about the Navy, okay? They don't know a thing about the Navy. And I can quote this guy because he let me quote him in my book. Corey Andreka is a Naval Academy graduate who was in the first group of hires by a major company out of Silicon Valley. Okay, this Naval Academy guy.
Corey's a classmate. I know him.
You know him. Okay, great.
Yeah.
We won't say which company. And so he came to the
I know
Naval
which
Academy.
company I know which company you're
Yeah,
talking
okay.
about, though.
He's incredibly wealthy. I mean, all the foundation were swarming around him, and he just, I just want to talk to the midshipmen. So we got him to the cyber group, And one of the midshipmen jumped up and said, "Sir, you work for this company. How could the Navy be more like your company so we get better?" And he goes, "What the hell are you talking about?" He goes, "My company is hardly 10 years old. The Navy has gone through world wars and great depressions and developed steam engines and planes and submarines. And, they kept Europe from starving. They faced down communism. Like, learn from the Navy. My gosh, we'll help you, but you're the Navy, right?" I mean, it was just a great answer, right? And that's what I'd say is naval engineers, especially, I hope, as sad as it is for people to be dying in this war, I hope the naval engineers realize their profession is now being talked about in North Dakota, right? These ships that are incredible, that are at sea for a year, they're taking care of our people, they're opening the sea lanes. I know that the diplomats are back and forth, but that you have a profession that's age is old, right? When did the first ship go to sea? We don't know. 8,000 BC, right? The first plane didn't go in the air until 1903, right? I mean, so the first car and truck wasn't until, 1894 or whatever, right? They're in the oldest profession ever, and they should have confidence to talk with the AI scientists, the specialists, right? And say, "Thank you, we honor what you know, but you don't know a darn thing about the Navy, right? And so let's do this together. Let's go down to the sea in ships with AI." And then for the Navy leaders, the same thing. These AI scientists in Europe are saying, they had three, I think, concerns, human vitality, mass unemployment, and they said war with AI weapons. And they said they acknowledge we don't have the expertise, but we're counting on the military being thoughtful about this. I mean, these are people winning Nobel Prize going, we're counting on the U.S. military to be thoughtful, right? So for the CNO and all the others, they're at an epic time in history to learn from these AI people, but they come to the table as co-equals, not as supplicants, right? How do we employ AI to make the world a safer, better place, not lose control of this in some wild arms race, not have our ships sunk to the bottom because we didn't adapt fast enough. I mean, it's epic times. I'll be writing in the history books about the CNO and the fleet commanders during this time. And I know many other them were just back to the ITs, they were focused on day-to-day reliability, adaptability, and they did great work. The fleet commanders of 19 fill in the blank or 2000, whatever. But the ones now, they'll be making history, and we just need them to get it more right. And I'm glad to be helpful on your podcast, ASNE, and the Navy where I can. I'm still doing some defense contracting work for the Army because these are epic times. So that would be my main message is approach it as a co-equal with a long-serving, important organization, and let's bring AI to make it better. And the last point about cyber, that we don't bring in the Trojan horse and lose control of this, which is why it's crucial to have the vitality of the human mind in control of these things ultimately.
Indeed. And so thank you, Dr. Mark Hagerott, for taking this time to discuss and reflect on your presentation, The Emergence of Intelligent Machines, Framing the Challenge for the Navy and Our Sailors. I'm sure we're going to have you back again to discuss your book after it comes out on Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the podcast of the American Society of Naval Engineers.